This part session of our two-day conference. Thank you for coming. I'm going just to remember everyone briefly the program for the afternoon. Okay, so we are going to start now with Dr. Ashley Marshall, who's going to speak about fabricating the force, the myth of the master of fictions. Then, after her, we are going to have a presentation of an artist, of Thomas, who was with us last day, and we are going to get the mass of his presentation and his photos. So after his brief introduction about his work, we will move to Elcar building, okay? And once there, you can admire his work. Then we will come back here again because we are going to have the two last presentation done by Dr. Brian Lefferman and Dr. Amaya Daniel, both of them from the University of the Basque Country. But curiously enough, Brian is from Canada and Maya is from Poland. So it means kind of international way of finishing the conference and the program. And yes, to finish with everything, from 6:30 to 7:30, we are going to have a special music session. So everything is more or less organized. And if you want to be in a concert for free, okay, you will have the chance as well. So, before starting, I want just to say thank you to Dr. Marshall for being here, for accepting our invitation. And it's an enormous pleasure to have you with us, because especially most of our audience is currently studying British literature from both 17th and 18th century. So I guess they will have lot of ideas, possible questions, but especially you are going to present a different view from the one we are seeing in class, because we are always out of time. So it's going to be, super. So she's an associate professor of English at the University of Nevada, Reno. She's the author of The Practice of Satire in England from 1658 to 1770. Published by Johns Hopkins, and she has also published another study about Swift and history, politics, and the English past by Cambridge. So, I mean, those are like two big publishing houses and two big books. She has also published several articles on Swift, Defoe, and others. And she's currently completing a study of political journalism in London. So, once again, thank you for coming, and we are going to just say welcome to her, okay, in Spanish style. And you can start.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me okay? Is that all right? I have a little bit of a cold. I apologize for that, but I'm really happy to be here. I appreciate the invitation. I think I'm doing something a little different from most of what you've been hearing, not just in terms of period focus, but also just in terms of methodology and kind of what I'm interested in. I'm glad to know that there are some fans of the 18th century here. It's my favorite century. It's a century I thought I would never have anything to do with when I went to graduate school. I said anything but that. Medieval, early, 17th century, Victorian, modernism, contemporary, drama, fiction, anything but the 18th century. And here I am. I love it. I think it's a period that too often gets thought of as settled, sort of dry and dusty and old, and we know everything about it. That's far from the case. And one of the things that's happening over the last 10 years or so, and I think will continue to happen for another generation at least, is a kind of general and extensive demythologizing of a lot of things we thought we used to know. And that's sort of what I am doing here. So it's a slightly different kind of thing, but I hope it will change the way you think about this guy. So Defoe was born probably in 1660, and the probably there indicates just how little we know about him. He died in 1731. He was a pen-for-hire political journalist and pamphleteer. He's now known principally, of course, as the guy who wrote this, Robinson Crusoe, religious tale about a man marooned on an island, published in 1719. He's also known for Moll Flanders, which is about that, racy, which is very different from Robinson Crusoe. For those books and for Journal of the Plague Year and Roxana, both of which pretended to be true, pretended to be memoirs, he's now widely regarded as the father of the English novel. a characterization I've spent a lot of time challenging. So what I want to talk about are the sort of changing assessments of Defoe and whether these changes make sense. You've been hearing a lot about the myths that authors create or the myths that are formed by and about cultures. I want to talk about how we sometimes mythologize our authors. So I think there's something to be learned about Defoe, who is a major canonical author, obviously, but also I want to see him as a kind of cautionary tale for the way we do authors, the way we do literary biography. Most people who think about Defoe and myth think about Robinson Crusoe, the myth of the hard-working man of faith who colonizes a little empire and ends a self-made man, very, very richly rewarded. The myth of bourgeois colonization by conquest, and the myth of the self-made man. I don't want to talk about that. I want to talk about the myth of Defoe. Okay, Defoe has been variously constructed by himself, by contemporaries, by biographers and critics. He's been seen as a liar and a saint, as a hasty scribbler and a master craftsman, as a moralist and a commercial drudge. His stock has risen steadily from his death to the present, thanks largely to two huge transformations in his reputation. The first occurred late in the 18th century, when he was first recognized as a novelist. The second took place in the 1960s, when Defoe abruptly went from being seen as a slapdash hack to being seen as the father of the English novel, a serious artist defined by his, quote, literary ambition and innovation. A lot of good work has been done in the last half-century. We understand the events of his life and read the novels a great deal better than we used to. But Defoe, as we now think of him, the literary Defoe, is a relatively recent creation. He's now treated much like other canonical 18th century authors, like Jonathan Swift and Henry Fielding and Lawrence Sterne, but he represents a very different kind of writer. So my position is that we need to rethink the way we construct him and interpret his work, that we need to demythologize him. I'm going to focus on, one, the rise of Defoe's literary reputation, two, the connection sometimes assumed between his life and his works, 3, the neglected problem of anonymous publication and its implications, and 4, what we really know about Defoe, what we can reasonably conclude about his sense of himself as a writer. The bottom line is that Defoe's reputation has changed radically, and the current story we tell about him turns out to be too much the stuff of fiction, fabrication, invention, myth. Defoe's contemporaries mostly saw him as a journalist, propagandist, projector, a sloppy and incautious hack, a time-serving scribbler who deserved his place among Alexander Pope's dunces. Here are a couple of contemporary testimonies. A man of rashness and impudence, a mean mercenary prostitute, a state mountebank, a hackney tool, a scandalous pen, a foul-mouthed mongrel, an author who writes for bread and lives by defamation. The second quote there is from Pope's Dunciad, and earless is a reference to his clipped ear because he was a Puritan. The picture is of him in the pillory for libel. He distributed a poem beforehand when he knew this was going to happen, called A Hymn to the Pillory, which meant that instead of coming and throwing like rotten fruit at him, people came and threw roses at his feet. So it was another kind of middle finger to the government. It was quite a scene. Swift, the middle quote here, the big block of blue, the fellow that was pilloried, I forgot his name, is Swift pretending not to know. Swift and Defoe were rivals, and Swift was just too cool to notice him. Swift certainly knew who he was. The general consensus, a pilloried wretch who served and betrayed all parties. So his reputation in the half century after his death, insofar as he had one, was non-literary. Most of the obituaries in 1731 are brief but generous in their treatment of him as socioeconomic and political commentator, stressing his writings on trade in particular, of which there were many. What we find from his death to the present to late in the 18th century are a small number of passing allusions, most of them to works literary critics have never wanted anything to do with. The most substantive comments have to do with his political activities during the reign of Queen Anne, when Defoe is seen as a dissenting critic of high church extremism and the guy in the pillory. In the half-century after his death, Defoe is mentioned occasionally as the author of Robinson Crusoe, as a dissenter, as a journalist, sometimes scandalous, but not particularly important to English literature or the novel. He wasn't seen as significant until the very end of the 18th century. Only in 1790, 60 years post-death, in George Chalmers' Life of Defoe, was he treated as a mildly respectable English author and a proper subject of study. Chalmers' biography represents one of the two major turning points in the history of Defoe's literary reputation. The second, after which Defoe would be seen not only as a novelist, but as a good novelist, wasn't to happen for another century and a half. Defoe's 19th century biographers aren't terribly interested in his fiction. They see him as a socio-political activist, and the fiction is representing only a part of an active, busy life. The best biography to date remains James Sutherland's 1937 account. That top quote is Sutherland. He regards Defoe as a permanent civil servant who did not devote a lifetime to one great cause, but instead scattered his energies among a variety of transitory activities. In other words, not following an authorial trajectory, not trying to sort of make a name for himself, but ephemeral, scattered, topical. Sutherland admits that, quote, the need to earn a living often spurred him on to hasty and careless writing. Defoe was not a polished or scholarly writer, and his prose is rough and coarse. The best one can say is that his work wears well. This seems about right. This still seems about right. Such admissions, though, would be seen as blasphemy now. The idea of Defoe as artist dates only as far back as the mid-1960s, when Defoe's fiction abruptly went from being seen as hash served up by a greasy spoon cook to being admired as haute cuisine. And he went from being disdained as a crude, scribbling dissenter to being revered as a canonical heavyweight. Just before that, treatment of Defoe in 1950s histories of the novel had only suggested grudging admission to the club. As of the early 60s, his novels weren't seen as worthwhile subjects of literary study. By the late 1960s, the nature of Defoe's scholarship had changed and changed radically. Major scholars began talking in unprecedented, astonishing ways about such things as narrative technique, about literary form, about conscious artistry. There are a couple of instances here. The middle quote is a guy named John Robert Moore. Defoe's influence lies under much that is best in modern literature, and under much that is best in modern life, as the old bed of the ocean lies under the upper crust of the earth. What does that even mean? The Master of Fictions, 2001, is the subtitle of, by all counts, the standard biography now. The guy who wrote that, a guy named Max Novak, says, quote, I treat him as one of the great writers of his time, and an attempt to locate his excellence in his genius as a creator of fictions, and in the often underestimated complexities of his style and language. The often underestimated complexities of his style and language, his conscious artistry. The best scene in Robinson Crusoe, how many of you have read Robinson Crusoe? If you haven't, Read Maul Flanders, it's more fun. But Robinson Crusoe will make you a better person, maybe. But the best moment in Robinson Crusoe is when he's shipwrecked, he's on the beach, he takes all his clothes off because he's wet and he's cold, and then he swims back to the ship and dives under as it's going down and fills his pockets. You see the problem with that? His pants are on the beach. Defoe didn't reread this novel, or he didn't reread it carefully. This is not conscious artistry. What followed the change in the 1960s, in the 1970s and 80s, was a boom in new critical appreciation, touting Defoe as a writer of subtlety and skill. Interest in fiction other than Crusoe soared. Nobody had read the other novels before. People only really start reading them in the 70s and 80s. And critics began doggedly seeking unity among the fiction, looking for evolutionary development, or seeing them as manifestations of a coherent authorial program. By the mid-1980s, Defoe had been turned into a literary genius. So this is my lifetime, basically. He was a nobody about the time I was born in terms of fiction, and now he's a very big deal. The concept of Defoe, established in common critical imagination by the mid-1980s, has changed very little since, though it's been significantly developed and reinforced by the three modern biographers. The important names, for my purposes, are Max Novak and Paula Backscheider. Backscheider is the first great champion of Defoe's poetry, which had always previously been apologized for and sneered at, and justly so. Backscheider's eager to find Defoe participating in a grand poetic tradition, and far more than any of her predecessors, she devotedly provides lit-crit readings of his poems and his prose. She makes strenuous efforts to find proto-novelistic tendencies in Defoe's pre-1719, pre-Crusoe canon. So to see him working toward, consciously, the things that we care about, as though he shared our values. The teleological approach to the fiction now seems natural enough, and a number of critics have attempted to find the germs of Robinson Crusoe and the other novels in the earlier writings, but Backshiders is the first teleological biography. These studies, hers and the two after her, represent huge steps forward in a lot of ways, but they don't just sharpen our sense of Defoe, they transform him. For Defoevians of the last generation, fiction is what Defoe is developing toward, and his literary achievement is what defines him. The point I want specially to emphasize is that Defoe hasn't always been seen this way. What now seems natural would have been inconceivable 50 years ago. The notion of Defoe as a serious artist and literarily defined author is a creation, a bit of critical mythologizing that reflects our predilections rather more than his. So I'm going to turn just briefly to attempts made in the last generation to construct a coherent inner life, one that illuminates the fiction and is illuminated by the fiction. Until fairly recently, most of Defoe's students have presumed that we know almost nothing about what he felt and thought and wanted. When we talk of Defoe, we're talking about the works we think he wrote, the implied writer rather than the man, because he didn't leave any letters, he didn't leave any journals. The letters are all work letters written while he was a spy in Scotland, working for the Prime Minister. There are 2 personal letters, I think, written right before he dies. There are no letters to his wife. There are no childhood diaries. There's no juvenilia. There's none of that stuff that we would use to find out what he felt and thought and wanted. And yet, one of the fundamental assumptions of literary biographies of Defoe and others is that a crucial connection exists between his life and his works. So this raises questions about the inherent mythologizing not only of hagiography, but of all literary biography. One of the features of Backshiders' biography in particular is its buoyant certitude that we can reconstruct its subject's outlook and emotions. She's convinced that she can recreate the way the world felt to Defoe. So here are 2 examples that are equally ridiculous, I think. After Robinson Crusoe, Defoe began to find new pleasure in his work. He came to accept that he was meant to be a writer. His typical childhood daydream involved a moment at which a hero triumphed over his adversaries by some remarkable feat of strength or wit. How likely do you think it is that we know what Defoe's typical childhood dream is? How likely are scholars in 100 years going to be able to reconstruct your typical childhood daydream? Do you know what your typical childhood daydream was? Some of you might. This is fiction. Conclusions about Defoe the man have to depend upon what he said about himself, what others said about him, what he did, and what he wrote. All of these sources, for a variety of reasons, are dubious. Defoe's activities tell us a lot about his causes and commitments, but very little about his feelings. So we're left with his writings, and his writings are problematic in ways that I'll get into in a second, but the letters thing is one part of it. Backshider has great faith that we can know Defoe through his writings, or at least that she can. She says recently, quote, "Getting to the person beneath, the core of the human being, is the biographer's job. This approach strikes me as essentially delusory. The problem of circularity is acute. Our reading of the works derives from our sense of the man, and our sense of the man derives from our reading of the works. Too strong a desire to present the core of the human being turns the biographer of Defoe into a fiction writer." A problem that scholars have overlooked for an amazingly long time is why we think we know that Defoe wrote his major works. The fact that he published almost all of his work anonymously, as Defoevians have remarked, sorry, I tangled that slightly. He published almost everything anonymously, and everybody knows that. But the scale on which this is true has had much less comment. And the way anonymity affects reading and interpretation has never been fully explored. The percentage of Defoe's output that originally appeared without his name on it is remarkable. Of the 249 books and pamphlets listed as his or probably his in the most recent bibliography, 249, only 4 carry his name on the title page, and 3 of those were published only in Edinburgh. So the London reputation would have been very different. The 4th is a 1715 autobiographical pamphlet called An Appeal to Honor and Justice. It was a self-defense, so he sort of had to claim it. There are a few reprintings from his journal that bear his name. Not a single new work appeared with his name on it between 1715 and his death in 1731. So the whole time he's writing fiction, he's totally anonymous. He's also writing a lot of other things. So the question of who knew what about Defoe's writings is messy, and the details aren't very important for my purposes. What does matter is that Defoe's original readers would mostly not have thought in terms of an authorial canon, and wouldn't have had access to authorial viewpoint when reading particular pieces. And he knew that. Defoe did not write with the assumption that readers would have any idea of who the author was. So the kind of biographical reading that we're inclined to do is sort of bogus for Defoe. The fiction remained almost completely unconnected to Defoe throughout most of the 18th century. Somehow one of his rivals discovered his authorship of Crusoe, but not many of his contemporaries seem to have known or cared. Most references to Crusoe in the 18th century don't associate it with Defoe. His name didn't appear on the title page until 1781, 50 years after his death. Another important fact is that Crusoe, now universally regarded as the first novel, or at least proto-novelistic, is listed in book ads throughout the century under voyages and travels, rather than poetry, plays, and novels. It was clearly taken straight by a lot of people for a long time. Here's the title page for Moll Flanders. You see that last line, written from her own memorandums, so it too purports to be true. Another one, A General History of the Pirates by Captain Charles Johnson. Defoe always disappears. Every title page is like this. The great problem of Defoe studies right now is the ghastly mess over his canon. No one has any idea what to do about it. The Defoe Society has spent the last decade wringing its hands and pretending not to notice. There's no real way forward. In 1971, John Robert Moore produced a vastly inflated canon, including 570 items, mostly attributed to Defoe because Moore said he could hear Defoe in them. This top quote is Moore. It was Defoe's common practice to conceal his authorship. It is the task of the student of Defoe to discover it. He also says, quote, as long as Defoe lived and wrote, he whistled many of his favorite airs, and if his friends would take the trouble to listen, he might be almost entirely preserved. So we can find Defoe. We can hear his voice. The problem is, Defoe says to Harley, to the Prime Minister of England, in one of his letters, your lordship will perceive I have disguised the style, and I am persuaded nobody will so much as guess it is mine. So who are we to believe? Defoe's most recent bibliographers have cut the Moore canon in half, which is good, but we're still in trouble. The two major modern biographers stuck with Moore, basing their constructions of Defoe on a lot of works he almost certainly did not write. This is a great big problem, especially since those biographers want to read Defoe's personality from all those works he probably did not write. The bigger problem is that even the newer, more conservative canon is a lot shakier than most people realize. By my count, there are 67 items, and only 67, that can be ascribed to Defoe with any certainty. The most upsetting examples are two of the three principal novels. For most of us, Moll Flanders and Roxana are part of the critical core that makes Defoe Defoe. How certain are we that he wrote them? They were never, not once, connected to Defoe in his lifetime, and not for several decades beyond it. Both were ascribed to him for the first time in the 1770s, more than 50 years after their original publication, by a notoriously dodgy and dishonest bookseller named, ironically, Francis Noble. Noble had a tendency to make up imprints, to put false imprints on things, to doctor the title pages to sell more copies. He had printed editions of both of these novels in the 40s and 50s without any indication of authorship, but in the 70s he decided that works of fiction such as Moll Flanders and Roxana could be rewritten for a respectable circulating library readership. He evidently calculated that having Defoe's name on the title page might help. The texts that Noble added Defoe's name to were radically eviscerated. Cleaner, finer, more genteel. Defoe's thief turns into a hard-working, conscientious social climber, and his whore is turned into a devoted mother and wife. The results are so different from the original that their author wouldn't have recognized them. To each of the novels, Noble adds a preface signed Defoe and dated 1730, so 6 and 8 years after the novels were originally published. In those prefaces, Defoe retains the claim that these were true stories written by Moll and Roxana, given to him, and he published them too quickly. He should have cleaned them up, so now he's going to introduce these cleaner versions, slightly edited by him, to the world. Noble dates the prefaces in 1730, probably because that's just a few months before Defoe died. So that explains why he didn't actually get around to publishing them in 1730. So Noble says, the editor, but it's Noble, says that when he first encountered Moll and Roxana, he'd been surprised to find expressions so much beneath the author of Robinson Crusoe, but adds that happily he found these manuscripts and now he can release them to the world. That part doesn't matter so much. The particulars don't matter. But how much faith should we have in attributions made by a rogue publisher 45 years after Defoe's death, especially when what he's ascribing to Defoe are badly mangled versions and not the texts we know and use? Part of Noble's tale is manifestly ridiculous. The idea that Defoe returned to Moll and Roxana to rewrite them late in life is totally implausible given everything we know about his publishing tendencies. Those Defovians who mention Noble grant that fact, but still assume he's right about the attribution. Of course, that's possible. It's possible that everything else is wrong, that everything is cooked except for the attribution. But really, there's no particularly good reason to take the attribution seriously. That's the evidence, and the evidence stinks. The extent of Defoe's canon we'll never fully know. What is clear is that he frequently tried to concoct documents which appeared to be true. In other words, he consistently removes himself from his writings. What this means is that we should be extremely reluctant to go looking for the man in any of his works, or to use what we think we know about the man to read those works. Defoe is pretty unusual among major canonical 18th century writers. We just don't know that much about him. Defoe, in scare quotes, has been understood in very different ways from his lifetime to the present day, his character variously summarized, and his central importance variously defined. Given the vast disparity between our image of him and how he was understood from his death until not very long ago, some stock-taking seems to be in order. In addition to the strictly factual record of when he was married and when he died and where he was year by year, well, what do we know? What is undoubtedly true about Daniel Defoe? In the realm of inner psychology, what we know for certain is that we don't know much of anything for certain. Despite the insistence of recent biographers to the contrary, we cannot reconstruct the way the world felt to him. Neither can we tell, as has been claimed, how much he loved his wife, how affectionate he was toward his children, whether he enjoyed fireside conversation, how he felt about pranks, the degree to which he brooded over the past, which of his works he liked the best, what his typical daydream involved, etc. Defoe repeatedly took bold positions, but personally self-expressive he was not. What about Defoe's sense of himself as an author, which is an altogether more interesting question? Novak pointed out in 1962 that Defoe likely viewed the novels as only minor achievements, and that his writings on trade almost certainly meant more to him. Of course, we don't know that. We don't even know what he wrote. But an impartial survey of what we do know and what we do have suggests something about self-definition. I think Novak was right in 1962. I suspect he was right, but I wouldn't put it in print. A few things we know. The overwhelming majority of what we know Defoe wrote, he produced as a journalist, satirist, and controversialist. And he published it anonymously, probably for a variety of reasons. He seems to have gone to considerable lengths in several instances to avoid having his responsibility for a work known. One of the truths about Defoe is that he did not systematically cultivate an image of himself as an author. He never signed or claimed Robinson Crusoe, much less the other novels. He's persistently anonymous and self-effacing. He does not overtly put himself into his works. Nothing in the few surviving letters suggests that he imagined the preservation and publication of those letters, which was a big move to make as an author in the 18th century. Pope, do you guys read Pope? Do you like Pope? I don't like Pope. I always put just a little bit of Pope on the syllabus, but I tell people, we're only going to do a little Pope, but there was only a little Pope. He was like 4'6". He was tiny, and he was mean, and he was sneaky. He wrote a bunch of letters with an eye toward posterity, but you couldn't publish them yourself because that looked vain, so he leaked them to somebody he knew would publish them, and then sued the guy for publishing his letters. But it got his letters out there. But Defoe didn't do that. He didn't play those games. If he had literary aspirations, they seem to have departed him along about 1706, very early in his writing life. Throughout his life, as his letters and the shape of his career suggest, Defoe wanted to be involved in socio-political affairs and delighted in his ability to get results. The majority of his extant letters were written to Robert Harley, then the Prime Minister of England, while Defoe was serving as a government spy in Scotland, another part of his career that doesn't get much attention. And the Defoe who emerges from the epistolary record is a capable and resourceful tactician, prepared to do whatever necessary for his cause and exhilarated by scheming. In January 1707, he reports to his boss, for example, quote, "I have incognito gotten into the company of some of the people who came here on the design I mentioned." A month earlier, he had beseeched Harley, quote, "not to let it be known that he had received a copy of a Scottish committee's report from Defoe, who had clearly obtained it under false pretenses. Quote, "It would so lessen my esteem among them," he explains, "that I should be very ill used by them and no more consulted with on any occasion." So he's sneaky. He's a master of disguise. As a 1754 writer would say of Defoe, quote, "The man knew what he had to do, and he knew how he was to do it." In his letters and throughout most of his writing life, Defoe does seem energized by and desirous of engaging in political business. Most of this gets downplayed when we talk about him as the father of the novel. Defoe's reputation has tended to be either as a devious pen for hire or, for his defenders, something of a Boy Scout. He was neither. He's not a traitorous rogue, and he's not a patriot saint of unimpeachable morals and entirely consistent principles. He quite obviously had strong commitments to religious toleration, to the Protestant succession in England, to commerce, to which he was devoted all his life. He was just as obviously an opportunist who wrote for the moment and wrote for bread. He wrote simultaneously for both parties, functioning as a mouthpiece both of the government and its opposition at the same time, which is awkward. Had he been a wealthier or a luckier man, he would probably have traveled a different path. But as scholars have often observed, he was frequently broke and he had a family to feed. He seems to define fair play pretty broadly, but he does have limits. He has a genius for understanding what a particular situation will require. His shape-shifting and impersonation have much to do with his awareness that different causes have different needs. Defoe is a slippery character and a master fabricator. He's spun myths as much as he's become one. He's sometimes careless, and he's not a great poet, a gifted literary technician, or a Boy Scout, but he has a flair for mimicry and deception and indirection. This is the thing about him I most admire, probably. His late 19th century biographer, William Mento, said famously, quote, "Defoe was a truly great liar, perhaps the greatest liar that ever lived." Defoe was a liar, a great liar, a tremendously effective liar, often in the service of what he regarded as very good causes. So what does this add up to? I'm arguing that our Defoe is a myth created by mid and late 20th century inhabitants of English departments. In some respects, the changes of the last 50 years have done Defoe great justice. In other ways, they've produced a shocking distortion. The prevailing image of him nowadays is a canonical figure, an artist to be studied alongside Swift, Pope, Fielding, Samuel Johnson, and a few others. That's not where he belongs. This isn't to deny his abilities. The old notion of him as a scribbler with neither principles nor talent was seriously wrong, and it needed to be resisted. We've learned a lot in the last 50 years, but we've also forgotten a truth we used to know, namely that the fiction represents only a brief passage in a long and varied career, and it might be a good deal briefer than we've ever imagined. One can imagine Defoe being baffled by the preferences and tendencies of his modern readers of all he attempted in the realms of trade and economics and, family instruction and moral instruction and propaganda and government work and being a spy, helping achieve the union between England and Scotland. Of all of that, we've seized on his potboilers and nominate him the father of the English novel. I spoke earlier of the canon problem. We don't know much of what Defoe wrote, and at this late date, there's probably no way to contest much favored works, however dubious they are. I've tried. I think I've gotten kicked out of the Defoe Society, which is a relatively new thing for my sacrilege. But we need to realize that the uncertainties that limit our grasp of Defoe and his works have dire implications. Whatever canon we construct, it makes a huge difference to our image of Defoe, and for him, more than for any other major 18th century writer, a frighteningly high proportion of what we talk about or conclude depends on faith. that faith is very ill-founded. Scholars of the current generation mostly don't remember a time in which Defoe was not regarded as a conscious artist, and the literary viewpoint is deeply ingrained in them. The revolution of 1960 isn't even a memory. We've got two fat biographies, much depended upon by critics, whose authors present an interior life based on speculation and a much inflated canon. Most of us have been taught that Defoe's the father of the novel. What's the evidence that he contributed meaningfully to the form as practiced by the next generation of great novelists? Samuel Richardson, author of Pamela and Clarissa, was involved in the 1769 edition of Defoe's tour through the whole island of Great Britain, a kind of travel narrative originally published in 1724. But to my knowledge, neither he nor Henry Fielding ever mentions Defoe in his capacity as a fiction writer. Tobias Smollett, the author of Humphrey Clinker and Roderick Random and other late 18th century novels, sneers at Defoe as a grubby party pen. If Lawrence Sterne, the author of Tristram Shandy, thought about Defoe, he never said so. Wherein lies the evidence for regarding Defoe as the father of a genre toward which he showed no real inclination and in which he had no known influence? We have in the last half-century created a major novelist on the basis of our own preferences and on the basis of shoddy attributions, and that really needs to stop. There are just too many uncertainties and too huge a difference between what we know about Defoe and what we behave as though we know about Defoe. At the first Defoe Society meeting a few years ago, I talked about some of this and some other stuff, but I remember there were about 80 people in the audience, all of them inhabitants of English departments, which is where Defoe lives. And I said, Defoe doesn't really belong in an English department. And Max Novak, who is kind of the titan of Defoe studies, you guys have KFC over here, right? You know Colonel Sanders? Max Novak looks a lot like Colonel Sanders, but he's very small, like white, a little shock of white hair and a little triangular white beard. He's adorable, but he's fierce. And I saw him put his hands on the table when I said that, and he was ready to stand and fight with me, even though I had a few pages left. And I said, sit, Max, we'll talk about it later. And he did, and we did talk about it later. We feuded, but, we're friendly. But Defoe doesn't really belong in an English department. At least one that can't make good on the promise of interdisciplinarity. Trying to make him fit into that model, to make him suitable for proper literary study, has led to the creation of a version of him remote from anything he would have recognized. Defoe was not without vanity, and he would undoubtedly welcome due appreciation of his talents, but he would in all probability be astounded by what we've chosen to privilege and by how we've gone about reading him. Making Defoe into the master of fictions, the father of the novel, and, quote, the founder of modern literature, encourages us to seek the man in the works and to demand cohesion and consistency of artistic purpose. Defoe has some lifelong values, hobby horses, and hostilities, but he's a profoundly occasional writer. I suspect that he saw himself more or less as he was seen in the decades after his death, as a talented and important journalist and pamphleteer. What we consistently find across 40 years, the 40 years of his publishing career, is a vastly learned, often fiery socio- and religio-political commentator, acutely aware of the ever-shifting interests of the reading public, immensely skilled in moving from one voice, form, or subject to another. Whether Defoe would be delighted, amused, or horrified by the picture of the great novelist we've created, we'll never know. But I have little doubt that he would be astonished by a development that he had no way of foreseeing. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Asley, for your presentation. It has been marvelous. I have to recognize that there are many, many details I didn't know about Defoe, for sure. And it has been a pleasure to listen to you. I have here a kind of proper question, but I'm going to let the audience to start asking, okay, and I will just remain for the end. So if you have questions, hands up, okay, and Martin will give you the speaker, okay, the microphone. And come on, don't be shy.
This is the period you're studying right now with Raoul, right? You should have plenty of questions. You've been doing Swift. You looked at Defoe as well? Yeah?
What have you been reading of Swift? Swift is my guy. I love Swift. I did this piece on Defoe, and it scared me off of him because I realized there was nowhere to touch down. You know, everything was so uncertain. And I've crept my way back to Defoe's studies through the journal called The Review, which might not even be a name to you. Even his students don't really study it. Even Defoe's scholars don't read it enough. But for the journalism book, I had to deal with The Review, and The Review is very safe. The Review has so much, attribution evidence. But Defoe, Swift is like Defoe in the sense that he's slippery and ironic, and you can't really believe what he says most of the time. But Swift, there's an enormous corpus of letters. There's a huge body of works we know he wrote. So Swift and Defoe both scare me. Defoe just scares me a little too much. I feel like I can't get my head around him. So I feel like this is what I did with Defoe studies was go in and sort of drop a grenade and then leave, and now I won't go back. And I'm sure they're pleased by that in some ways. Though the younger generation of scholars has inherited some of the skepticism and is happy about testing that and challenging that. But the old guard lives on. But Swift, we're just in much safer territory because, you read these things in standard editions and you assume that it's all safe, right? There are not these questions with Swift. We know he wrote Gulliver. He left letters about, the process of composition and what he wanted Gulliver to do. So, Defoe never did that. Swift, I love talking about him, but I just couldn't think of what I could say about him here that would be really new. And I'm living over here this semester, so I don't have my books and stuff. So Defoe I know pretty well.
Hello.
Hi, you're brave.
Funny enough, we have to do a presentation this Wednesday about Robinson Crusoe and Daniel Defoe. And when we were doing the biography part of the author, we found information about that he was kicked out of England and that he wrote because he needed food and stuff. I wanted to know up to what point we can actually believe that information. Thank you.
Good question. So when I asked if you'd read Robinson Crusoe, everybody's hand should have come up, right? Or more of them. Maybe you have a couple of days still, right? I think that, the factual things are more or less true, though contested. There's a guy named John Martin who's genuinely crazy. There's a biography by him called Defoe, the Man Himself. And I urge you, if you ever see a copy of that, to look at it because it's hilarious. It posits a number of things like, Defoe's. He actually has a table of Defoe's same-sex relationships. I don't know what Defoe did or didn't do, and I don't care. But there's no evidence that, he had a fling with the prime minister. So this guy's crazy, and he's very aggressive, and I feel like about once a week I get an email from him that's contesting things like, the date of birth. He thinks Defoe was a full generation older than he was. So it feels like with Defoe, everything you have to be a little bit skeptical of. He wasn't really kicked out of England. He was, to my knowledge, he went to Scotland to serve as a spy, and he was sort of abandoned there and came back. But he was ostracized within England. He was put in the pillory a couple of times. He was in jail a lot for bankruptcy. And we know that because papers report it, and he writes begging people for money. So a couple of the letters we have to the prime minister are two connections of saying, I'm broke. I don't know how much of it helps us with Robinson Crusoe. Defoe never traveled. We tend to conflate the two a lot. Defoe never traveled. He was always broke. The Robinson Crusoe, Moll Flanders, and Roxana all do slightly questionable things, especially the women, but all do slightly questionable things, and yet at the end amass this tremendous fortune. If you do conversions between 1720s rates and now, you see that they're millionaires, basically. Defoe was always broke. Defoe might have believed in and imagined a kind of self-made man, but he wasn't one. I think beyond factual record, and in fact gets a little bit blurry here, right? One of the powerful things about myth is that it comes to look a lot like knowledge. But I think, be skeptical of most of it. We know when he died. We sort of know where he was, for a few years. He might have snuck off from London. I mean, we don't know. You're not checking passports, at the ports in England at this point. So I think I would say regard it all with a grain of salt, but especially the bridge between Defoe's life and Crusoe. I think we tend to want to see Defoe as a Crusoe-like character, a man of providence and a good man who works hard. This is just light years away from who Defoe really was.
More questions? I was just wondering, Ashley, thanks for the presentation. I think it's really fascinating stuff. Actually, it's a century that I still haven't delved too deep into myself, probably out of prejudice. And I was wondering, the first question I have for you, what made you look for new things in the 18th century in the first place? And then, to what extent is Daniel Defoe emblematic of the condition of being a writer in this period?
Yeah, that's great. Those are both great. And in some ways, what I care more about than anything is, not necessarily changing your mind about this one particular guy, but showing just how little is settled about this period. And I was a modernist when I got to graduate school. I was going to work on T.S. Eliot. And the modernists, I went to graduate school at Penn State University, and the modernists there were not very helpful. I didn't click with them. I couldn't work well with them. And the most helpful guy I had, the most helpful professor, was an 18th century guy. So I was, like C.S. Lewis, a reluctant convert. I started working on Andrew Marvell, who was a late 17th century poet. You probably know the Horatian Ode. But I started working on his Elegy for Cromwell, and I realized that much of our love of a period depends upon knowing it. And once you know it and identify the battles, you start to get really possessive. I mean, I'm very possessive now of the 18th century. I'm one of those angry reviewers that you're mucking up my period. So I try to keep it under control, but I'm very territorial about that. And one of the most exciting thing in the 18th century right now, in a nutshell, is that about 12 years ago, we got something called 18th Century Collections Online, which gives us access, if you have the database or you can go to libraries that do, gives us access to every work printed in England in the 18th century. So it's hundreds upon thousands of things, and every story that had been told before then had been told based on major canonical works. So the story of satire was the story of Dryden, Swift, Pope, Fielding, Johnson. That was it. My first book is on practice of satire in England, and I read 3,000 satires and wrote a different story, right? Because when you get beyond that tip of the iceberg, you start to see that these tendencies, the story we're telling isn't true. My good friend just published a book about the rise of the novel, in which she did the same thing. She read, instead of the 8 great novels, Fielding, Richardson, Defoe, Smollett, Sterne, she read 500 novels or 800 novels or some ridiculous number like that of giant, terrible novels, and rewrote the literary history of the period. And what's happened there can happen again, and it is happening. So there's that great Bertolt Brecht line that disbelief can move mountains. And I think the 18th century, you're just seeing right now, this is the best time to be in the 18th century, because a whole lot of the things that we thought were true, the verities that we've long taken for granted about genres, about influences, about trajectories, all of that turns out to be built on just a sort of vanishingly small foundation. And so when you recontextualize and read all the stuff that all of a sudden is right there, access has never been easier than it is right now, the story starts to change. So I like that. I mean, this is an exciting period. This is not a period where I wonder, well, can I do important work? Can I change anything? Everything is changing. Everything is up for grabs. Every story needs to be tested against a much bigger canon now. And that fits with sort of broader tendencies in the last generation or so to read minorities and to read women and to read, my friend in Reno calls me the patron saint of the subcanonical, because I'm not just talking about expanding the canon to other great writers, but I'm saying these guys are really terrible writers, but they also matter to the story we tell. So, I mean, that's the most exciting thing. To what extent Defoe is emblematic? In one sense, he's very emblematic of a lot of the political divides of the country and the influence that they have on the kind of stories that we tell. I mean, Robinson Crusoe is, Defoe's very interested in economy, and at the time, the divide in the country was between the Tories, who thought that all enfranchisement should be based on the land you own, right? So it should be inherited wealth, and only the men who inherited wealth could be part of sort of civic society, versus the Whigs, of which Defoe is one, who thought you could make money, that you could, he believed in the merchant class, so you could be a social climber, right? And so the story of Robinson Crusoe is deeply ingrained in this giant political battle, and Defoe is emblematic, I think, of that political battle, and a lot of the religious battles. His canon, even the canon we're sure of, the much smaller canon, intersects a lot of those debates. He's also, I think, emblematic of a new kind of commercial writer, who's aware of writing for print for a much bigger audience, unlike the sort of court circulated things of the late 17th century. In terms of like great authors, he's very atypical, just in the sense that he didn't, for the reasons I've been saying, he didn't cultivate that image. But I do think he emblematizes quite a lot of what's changing in the 18th century in terms of concept of a writing process. I won't say authorship because it has these sort of big implications, but in terms of like what it means to be a writer, what it means to be a propagandist, what it means to be a player in a political world, for sure.
Right. I was asking also because one of the things about the 18th century is that we get a lot of anonymously published writings, but mostly more controversial texts or texts that are not realist, such as, I don't know, James Macpherson. We have Horace Walpole even publishing the first editions of the Catalogue of Otranto and anonymously, or as he played them out to be a translation, actually. So he didn't want to acknowledge his own authorship.
Right.
But in the case of Defoe, he was writing morally instructive works and so on. What was his problem about putting his name to the books?
Well, I think the morally instructing part, there were a variety of reasons to be anonymous. One is that, he got into trouble early in the 18th century. He was in debt. He got, sued a number of times for anti-government libel. He was very outspoken. And people traced his authorship in a couple of cases and arrested him. And that meant that he was a slightly tainted source. So he didn't want to be the scoundrel and the debtor who was getting on a soapbox and telling people how to behave. I think he knew he was setting himself up there. I mean, I suspect. I'm speculating here, but that seems like a logical reason to not claim those things. He wanted them to be taken seriously. He didn't want to open himself up to charges of hypocrisy. I don't know what sort of personal life he lives, really. Or what, there's not much record of how he was talked about in those ways, but I think the hypocrisy thing is important. And it also, to some extent, it was a kind of vanity, that he didn't want. I think for a lot of his works, maybe not those, I'd have to think about which ones, he really wanted the work to be its own vehicle, and he didn't want it to be about him. And that's, I think, pretty common in the 18th century, too. For a long time, playwrights were seen more like the script writers are of movies now, right? You don't know, you might or might not know who wrote them. Their name is in small print at the end of the movie, right? But the point is the movie. And plays were like that. The first Congreve's name appeared on the title page in 1699, and John Dryden said, "What is this? This is very peculiar, it shouldn't be about that." And so I think there's an inherited concept that anonymity is sort of more humble or something, but there were a variety of reasons to not do it. Novels, as you pointed out, are famously, not claimed on the title page. My friend Leah, who I mentioned, just published this book on the rise of the novel called Novel Ventures, published just a few months ago, traces this sort of numerically, and how many were called memoirs and how many were called sort of true histories, and but it's novels. I mean, they didn't recognize it as a genre the way we do now, and they didn't make that much money. They weren't going to be celebrities based on novels. I mean, that changes a little bit with Tristram Shandy and some of the later 18th century, that changes, but early on, this wasn't a game they recognized, so there was no need to claim it in that way. And I'm not saying Defoe made a unique choice that sets him apart in any way, but whatever his intentions were in not claiming them or however natural it was, it does create problems for what we can recover later. There are lots of novels that look like Moll Flanders, that look like Roxana. There are lots of other candidates for authorship. Some of them we don't know, but there are books we have no reason to believe that he wrote that look a lot like, Moll Flanders and Roxana. So that's kind of a mess. But you're right that he's not uniquely anonymous. But I think the scale and the fact that, Swift publishes Gulliver anonymously, of course, it's supposed to be Lemuel Gulliver's true story, right? But Swift, it was a scandal, and everybody knew he wrote it. It got him into a little bit of trouble, not as much trouble as he was on other occasions, but he leaves letters. It's unique to not have any sort of authorial apparatus to appeal to in Defoe's case.
Okay, thank you. More questions before we finish this session?
Okay, so I will ask mine. Okay, just something that we can understand, because we have been just seen in class that 17th century is partly controlled by religion, mainly in poetry with metaphysical poetry. Then we have Paradise Lost, and then the first proto-novel at the end of the century with John Bunyan's The Pilgrim's Progress. But then when we started with the first proper novel in the 18th century with Robinson Crusoe, I presented in class two images. The first one is Robinson Crusoe, just a kind of a British soldier, with Fridays completely surrounded, and second picture is taken 3 years later. And the image of Robinson Crusoe is completely different. He looks like the Messiah, he looks like a missionary, and Friday is not completely surrounded. And one is very close to the idea of the British imperialism, while the other is very close to the idea of spreading Christianity. Which is the right image?
Right, in the sense of what Defoe meant?
Yes.
Who knows? One of the strange things about Defoe is that he was supposed to be a good Puritan, right? A moral guy, an upstanding guy. He fought for religious toleration. He writes a lot about religion. He seems to project an image of himself that's very pious, and yet he, not so much in Robinson Crusoe, but in Moll Flanders and Roxana, if these are by him, he tells a story in which two very questionable women, they leave, they have children and leave them, they abandon their kids, they lie to men for money, they marry many times, they commit adultery, they steal, they prostitute themselves, they do everything wrong. In terms of like good Puritan conduct, right? So what you would expect to happen if Defoe is the controlling voice behind these things is that they're somehow punished for this, right? And then we learn a lesson that if you do these bad things, then you're going to, something bad's going to happen to you, right? Like that's every sort of basic, like moralism 101 is that you show sin being punished, right? But what happens in fact is that they both get richly rewarded. They amass huge fortunes, they get love, they get identity, they get everything they wanted and more, and then the curtain drops, right? So it's a pretty bad tale. It's a pretty bad moral lesson. If you read that back onto Crusoe, which we want to see. He's appealing to providence, and he's trying to do the godly thing. In fact, what he does is to me, is much closer to the sort of dubious colonizing impulse than it is to a real providential. It's much more. I think it's easier to read that book in secular ways than in spiritual ways, but a lot of people wanted to see it as a spiritual autobiography of sorts, assuming it's Robinson's book himself. But if you read other things he wrote, if Moll and Roxana are by him, then it changes the way I read Robinson Crusoe too, because all of a sudden we don't have to hold Defoe to that Puritan standard. I think then as now, that text, which was such a big, it was a blockbuster. It sold like hotcakes, even though it cost by our standards, like $75 or something, which is a lot of money to spend on a novel. When's the last time you spent $75 on a novel? It's never happened, right? So for whatever reason, it's sold, and not surprisingly, people appropriate it for different ends. But in terms of Defoe, I think either of those things or both of those things can be true, which is not a very satisfying answer, I realize, but he just doesn't leave us very much to go on, and there's so many contradictions. I tend to see it more as the former, or maybe not the former, but in the more secular way.
So do I.
Yeah.
And do you want to ask her something about Gulliver? I know that you have questions probably about this novel.
We can do it over coffee too,
Okay, yeah.
if you want.
It was so clear in class that you have no questions at all. Come on.
No questions about Gulliver? I have questions about Gulliver.
Yeah.
Can I ask you some questions about Gulliver?
Martin, Astrid.
Okay, I'm doing a dissertation that is part on Gulliver Travels, and I mentioned a little bit Robinson Crusoe, but I don't know really the novel. So my question is, I found a lot of information that Swift makes a parody of Robinson Crusoe. Do you think it is because of this secular myth, or it has to do a bit with imperialism, or just because he saw it as an uncaring writer, like that you just said, that maybe didn't revise his novel, or because he didn't have, I don't know, a great potential of a writer of his time, or it's both?
That's a good question. I think there's probably a little bit of a lot of that. He's parroting Crusoe almost certainly. The opening is pretty obviously an allusion, probably specifically to Crusoe because it was very popular. Swift was writing this mostly, circa 1720 I think the germ of it earlier, but he's writing this about the time Crusoe is a big deal, and so it's also an allusion more broadly to the great boom in travel writing. I think that probably what he's most interested in, I don't think he had any idea that Crusoe was Defoe, or we don't have any evidence that he knew that Crusoe was by Defoe, but they were kind of rivals, even though they both served the same man. They were on exactly opposite sides of on every issue. So if he did know, he would take particular pleasure in savaging that kind of writing. And I think we're supposed to see it as kind of a joke on authority and on the authority of writers, right? One of the books in his library, and a book that I think was pretty important to him, which is also relevant to Gulliver's Travels, is Lucian's True History, which is neither true nor a history. It's pretty funny. It's quite a slim volume. There's a little Penguin translation of it. It's sort of quintessential classical text in a lot of ways. But Swift is very interested in history and in narrative that tells a story that is not true and that is sort of ridiculously not true and yet purports to be true. Swift does as much as anybody, I think, to respond to the crisis of more and more text, right? As there are more and more competing narratives, there's less and less sense that something in print is true, right? I mean, you live in the Facebook and Twitter era. The whole disaster that is 2016 and there was 2016 in my country is, driven mostly by, the problem of not having a reliable news account. And Swift, I think, anticipated that problem in a really interesting way. So I think the idea of credibility and believability and, the Crusoe narrative and other narratives like that purport to tell you about these sort of strange things happening far away. I think Swift is poking fun at that, at the idea that you believe, particularly Whig narratives. I mean, I think Crusoe is very definitely a Whig narrative in the sense I was talking about, the kind of advocacy of a rising merchant class and advocacy of certain kinds of... Maybe you said something about the imperial mission, the empire problem, and I suspect that to some extent Swift at the time of Gulliver is more sensitive to this. He would never use that language, of course, but because of what's happening in Ireland, right? Obviously, and the famous scene in Gulliver of the floating island that the king can drop on the the object of his oppression anytime they get out of line is a very direct reference to that. So, to some extent, I think he would be critical of the Crusoe kind of imperialist mission, to be sure, though he doesn't. That's much more implicit throughout much of Gulliver. Swift earlier in his life wouldn't have given that a second thought, I suspect, but because I think Swift is mostly an authoritarian guy who identifies with institutions and identifies with country and wants to be on the side of the powerful, regardless of who they oppress. He didn't give a fig for Ireland before he got exiled there and got mad at the king and got mad at the prime minister because they didn't give him a place. And so he becomes, I think grudgingly, he becomes an advocate for the oppressed, but he never much likes them. And if they would just give him a place in the government in England, give him a bishopric back in England, he wouldn't care if they dropped the island on Ireland. He didn't think they were worth anything. So that's a little bit bad faith on his part to kind of invoke the imperialist or to critique the imperialist mission. But I think there's a lot of that. I think it's easy to focus on Crusoe because that's the one we like the best. But I think he's responding to a broader popularity of like Whig travel narratives. And it sells books, people like it. And so doing this bogus travel narrative was popular. Gulliver was popular. There's a great anecdote of the clergyman who reads Gulliver and hastens to his globe to find Lilliput. People don't, it's not credible. If you've read Gulliver, like when the horses are threading needles with their hooves, through their hooves, this is a joke. This is obviously not credible, but there was just a little bit that, tempted people into believing it. And Swift is sort of mocking, I think, our credulity there.
Okay, so once again, it has been a pleasure to have here today Dr. Ashley Marshall. Thanks once again. I think that we have to end this.